Hello, and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with Nurole, the business-oriented podcast that brings the boardroom to your channel of choice. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nurole, the board-level hiring platform that specializes in the high-value chair, independent director, advisory board member, and trustee placements that drive high-impact boards. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Patrick Dunne. Patrick is an experienced chair and serial social entrepreneur who has extensive experience of working with boards in Europe, Asia, and North America. Early on in his career at 3i, he built a resource of over 600 experienced directors who appointed to over 2,000 boards for 3i across numerous countries. The program he established became widely recognized as a model of adding value and a leader in best practice. He is currently chair of board consultancy, Board Delta, the charities, the EY Foundation and ESSA, the Education for Sub-Saharan Africa, and a trustee of the Chartered Management Institute, amongst others. Patrick is also the author of the book Boards, A Practical Perspective, which provides practical, realistic, thought-provoking, and useful guide to life as a board member that I can highly recommend. Patrick, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, real pleasure, Oliver. Great to be here.
Patrick, I'd love to start with just your story and your journey into the boardroom, because it's been an interesting one.
Yeah, well, I suppose I was born in a lovely little village in England called Toxteth, which is famous for many things, including riots and so on. Not a natural home for board members. I was very fortunate, although I'm mildly dyslexic, I was okay at maths, and I managed to get to Warwick University. So first in family, only one in street, all that sort of thing. And then I got a job in the chemicals industry, which I loved, with products, which was doing operations research, which really taught me a lot about system thinking and as much about managing relationships, because you might have a logical answer, but if you couldn't sell it to the other people in the business, it was pretty pointless. Then I did an MBA at Cranfield, and then I got into private equity before it was fashionable. So I joined 3i in the mid-80s and then ended up spending 26 years there. And that's where I really got the bug for boards, because I realized that the better the board we had, the more money we made and the less hassle we had. So I started to think about, what made a good board and so on. Whilst at 3i, I also helped out with the Higgs Review, which came up with the idea of the senior independent director and led to the creation of the 30% Club, and then was on a range of boards during my time there and since retiring. So that's a sort of crude trip through my trip from doctors to the board.
Brilliant. Well, that's an amazing story and makes you incredibly well qualified for this discussion today. Patrick, I'd like to start by just talking to you about dysfunctional boards, which you've talked about in the past. And it's been a learning journey for me, actually, over my time with Nurole, of how many boards are dysfunctional. The more board members I speak to, the more, when you get them in their honest moments, will reveal that their boards are dysfunctional. And when you share this insight with others, that most boards are dysfunctional, you see this sort of collective sigh of relief. And I think you've phrased this as most of us are operating on a spectrum of dysfunction, which I loved. You have talked, and in your book, you talk about this purpose, people, process, structure that you use to think about boards, and some of the basic things that people get wrong, like in terms of process, basically not having sort of minutes or ineffective chairing or pulled papers or ritualized agendas, whatever it might be, as well as on sort of more complex side of things, maybe around purpose, not having a clear vision and strategy in place, or in terms of the people, the sort of getting the composition or the team cohesion or understanding how to manage that conflict, right? But when we know all of this, why is it that so many boards are still dysfunctional? And what can we do about it?
Yeah, well, I think it is true that we're all on a spectrum of dysfunction, both individually and collective. And I suppose the mistake we make is to think that normal is high performing and high functioning. At the root of this, I think, is self-awareness. So I'm not sure we actually all do know that we're dysfunctional. We think we might be in a dysfunctional group, but it's kind of like everybody else that's dysfunctional. We're okay, rather than, we're contributing to that. There was some great work done by Harvard Business School a number of years ago by two guys, I think, called Deardorff and Rubin, and they tested people to see how self-aware they were. And then they put them into groups of similar levels of self-awareness. So, highly self-aware people, moderately self-aware people, and what I'd call the rhinos, blundering about, not really aware of the damage they were doing and not really caring either. And then they gave these groups some tasks to do, some decisions to take, some coordinating to do, and some conflicts to manage. And what they discovered was that, crudely, the highly self-aware groups composed of highly self-aware people, were twice as effective as those with lower levels of self-awareness. So I think anything that you can do to improve self-awareness will help. But of course, you then might ask the question, well, what is the overall level of self-awareness in professional organizations? Two other guys did some work on this. They were called Ethan Zell and Zlatan Kurzan, great names. And they did a meta-study of over, I think it was 375,000 people in this survey, combining data from 22 studies. And these are people from large organizations with feedback processes, with review processes. And they still found the correlation between people's own evaluation, their self-evaluation of their skills, capabilities, the impact they have on others, with reality, so that's objective performance or feedback from others, was only 0.29. So this is like a 3 out of 10, crudely. So generally, we're not as self-aware as we could. And then there's something around, even if you are self-aware, you can delude yourself to thinking, particularly if you're high performing relatively, individually, you can still imagine that, well, that's all right, I know I'm not good at this and I know I'm not good at that. And you don't then make any effort to improve, to enhance. And of course, you might be a very good functional leader, but not necessarily a good strategic director. You might be very good in situations where things have gone well. You might be very good at things which need rapid turnaround, but can you be good in different phases of an organization's development? Sometimes, and as we all found with COVID, a sudden shift in the phase of the organization can catch you out. It's just not your game. That's just not the game that you're good at. And so, there's no surprise to me the churn through COVID of chairs, CEOs, and non-execs as a consequence of that. I think the other thing that's really interesting, and it's actually, I remember 20 years ago we did a Hicks review, I was fussed by the fact that to that point, the reviews been done had focused on the role of the board, the role of the chair, the role of the non-exec. And I said, well, how can there be a high-performing board if they don't have a high-performing relationship with the executive? And I think that's often where it goes wrong. It's in that intersection. I use a series of Venn diagrams typically when I'm sort of talking about this, because I am mildly dyslexic and I find diagrams easier. So, imagine, Oliver, a parallel universe of two circles that don't intersect at all. The board and the exec, that's not really high performing. Imagine one where they're almost completely overlapping. The non-execs are trying to do the jobs of the execs. That's not going to work. But where you have this sort of a nice, neat intersection where the board and the exec have their own focus, and that's what I meant by this purpose. It's not just the purpose of the organization; it's the purpose of the board and the exec. But then they agree what goes in that intersection. The big stuff. And through COVID, it was fascinating actually, because you saw more discussion probably than for some time between boards and execs about, well, what's our role, what's your role as we go through this crisis? And I think if whatever that level of intersection was before COVID, it bulged out a bit during the heat of the intensity of the main crisis of that. I think the smart boards talked about, and understood that was only going to be for a phase. And then they've actually managed to sort of shrink back that intersection to a more natural level since. But I suspect that's a higher level than it was pre-COVID, particularly given some of the other things that have come down the tracks. I mean, the other thing to say about dysfunction, I really enjoy it. I really like working with dysfunctional people. And actually, if you think of the venture, private equity, social enterprise space, actually some of the best organizations, best ideas have come from people who wouldn't normally be considered to be the norm in terms of the way they operate. The trick, I think, is being able to capitalize on the brilliance of people there, and find some way to control the dark side that comes out as well. And that I think is a tremendously fun thing to do if you can do it.
That resonates a lot. I think someone once said to me, the reason so many boards are dysfunctional is because they're dealing with inherently unanswerable questions. If the questions they were dealing with were easy, they would have been solved by the executive team more often than not. And so you're wrestling with these grey challenges often. And so, of course, you reflect that at the group level. For me, it's often very easy to think of examples of the boards that have gone wrong. And you can think of the disasters. I often refer to BP Macondo and Grenfell Tower and others without making judgments, but where you think, well, maybe on another day a board might have been able to anticipate some of those things. But it's harder to think about the examples of boards that really get it right. And maybe that's the sort of loss aversion bias in me, or I don't know what. But what are the best in class examples that really stand out for you of boards who are really getting this right?
Well, if you think of what boards have had to deal with in the last 2 to 3 years, I think it's remarkable that so many organisations have survived and actually done quite well. There are also organisations which have really struggled and had a hard time, self-inflicted, but others where actually their market just went, or the economics just fundamentally changed relatively quickly, and there was nowhere to go. There was nothing they could do. So I think it is very easy to judge others. It's harder from the inside. But I would say actually most boards are doing a pretty good job when you look at it. The number of major catastrophes is relatively small, and it should be. You want to sort of have the structure in place to do that. I think the businesses which, I was struck through the pandemic with the businesses which had the best balance of the way in which they viewed their different stakeholders. To me, you could see the proof of them being more resilient. So if you did have, you didn't have anorexic supply chains, you had actually healthy supply chains because you'd not battered them down on every cost. They had the least disruption. If you had healthy suppliers, actually it was easier. If you had a very vulnerable supply group, they were vulnerable and something big happened, and those that had very strong rapport with their teams, their people, loyalty was very strong. People put the extra effort in. Some of the corporately and social sector organisations, and most notably in some public sector organisations, the way that people worked together under intense pressure to survive, help other people survive, all the rest of it was truly remarkable. And some of that is the human spirit, I'd like to think. Some of it is also the leadership. But actually, quite a lot of it, to my way of thinking, is just back to that simple triangle of purpose, people, and process. If people feel that the purpose is good, and that purpose can be making money, it can be all sorts of saving lives, it can be a whole range of things. If you can assemble the right people and get them working together in the right way, and the plumbing is good, so stuff works, the decision-making process works, the information flows work, so those decisions are well made and well judged, and the communication processes are good, then I think you can really achieve a huge amount in quite difficult circumstances. But if you don't have clarity of purpose, if you don't have the right people working together in the right way, and if the plumbing's all wonky, then the water's flowing everywhere but where you want it, and you can't really achieve very much. So clarity, I think, is probably one of the hallmarks, I think, of the good chairs I know, and the organisations that I think coped best with what we've been through, and to some extent what we're still going through.
Interesting. Which of those legs do you feel is the hardest to get right? For me, it feels like process is a bit more, it's tick the box. You do it or you don't. Purpose and people feel more difficult to get right. But is that how you think about it?
I think about it in a 3-dimensional way, because I think, you can have people, you can have a wonderful purpose, but if you can't then assemble the right people and you can't get them working together in the right way to achieve that purpose, then you might as well not have bothered. Generally speaking, the right people will come up with the right process. So I tend to think that the people is probably the most important thing, because they will, even if they're given a slightly off purpose, they'll clarify that, they'll simplify that, they'll get the right processes. So that's where I would start. I think it can be difficult in some organizations because of the sector that they're in or particular challenges that you're taking over. If you take over as a chair or a CEO, it can be hard initially to attract people because, the company doesn't look as inspiring to join as you want it to be. But for some people, that will be the inspiring bit, that they can go and turn it around. They can go and make it better. A very good example, I think, at the moment is the Chartered Management Institute, which has been a big turnaround over a reasonable period. And the clarity was gained very quickly. It was hard for a while to attract the right people. Then that started to happen. And then, bit by bit, the momentum turned. And that's turned from, an organisation that was severely challenged 10 years ago to one that's, had a very positive kind of contribution through the crisis, is performing on all its metrics very strongly. But it was hard to get the right people to join it in the early stages of the turnaround.
There's that wonderful line of camel is a horse designed by committee. And whenever I sort of hear that idea that it's the board that's responsible for setting that vision and the strategy, somewhat jars, because where I've seen it most work best normally is that it's been the CEO who set that vision, and often very closely with the chair. And it's been an iterative process, but normally there's been a lead on it. How have you seen it work best? What do you think works best on that?
Well, to my thinking, the board's responsible for making sure there is a really good purpose and vision, and they're clear. Who actually utters the words at what moment, who goes up with it, doesn't really matter to me. So you might need to appoint a CEO to do that, to come up with that. It may be already there, but lost in the past or confused. So you might have to sort of bring it out. That can be the case. I think the key thing is that's one of the things I think that goes in that intersection of the Venn diagram. And it almost doesn't matter, because sometimes an organisation loses its way. The board might clarify the purpose and vision and then recruit a CEO to execute it. It might recruit a CEO to help it through that process of determining what that is and then execute it. You just need to be clear where you're at and what you're doing. I think also boards and CEOs are transient figures really in the life of an organisation, and purposes need to be adapted as you go. In any startup, you've done a highly successful startup. I'm pretty sure at the beginning, where you thought you were going to be making money and having success probably isn't where you've had most success now. So I think you have to be flexible and agile really to that. I mean, ESSA, which I founded at Educated Sub-Saharan Africa, we've had a remarkable time over the 6 years. A couple of the things we thought would be real winners have been, and a couple of things which we thought would be an incredible struggle have been. A couple of things which you thought these are going to be really straightforward really haven't. So you need that kind of flexibility and that self-awareness. The other triangle I like to sort of draw myself up for a board is a triangle which has arrows within it, all pointing towards one of the corners. But the idea of this is that the board is pointing in the same direction, but there are enough degrees of difference to keep challenging whether that is the right direction, whether we're going at the right speed, whether we're taking too much risk, all of that kind of thing. And I think if you've got one of those for the exec as well, there's a good healthy dynamic there where you're never going to get complacent. You're always a bit restless to want to do better, but you're not chaotic, kind of in the sense that all the arrows are pointing in completely different directions. I have a little test I use, which for boards where I've been asked to help, and I ask each director individually, and you have your individual chats. What do you reckon the top 3 big decisions the board needs to take in the coming year? And my personal best so far from 7 people was 27 top 3 things. And the reason for that was obviously some people weren't that data savvy, couldn't count, but they were changing their mind in the conversation. But the most important part of that is the fact that as a board, they had not sat down and agreed what they thought the priorities were in terms of those big decisions. And if you do that with the management, in that sort of intersection of the Venn diagram-like way, you're more likely to be aligned. I mean, if everyone's got a different idea about what the big challenges are and the big decisions are, that's going to be very difficult to get it right, isn't it? You're not focusing your time.
Super interesting. Just one of the things that strikes me as an interesting challenge for organizations and boards at the moment is where to draw the line in terms of their purpose. And you have had Black Lives Matters, Roe versus Wade, where organizations seem to be falling over themselves, some feeling like they need to get involved, others feeling like that they shouldn't get involved. How do you think about that when you're sort of thinking about the purpose of your boards?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I chaired a group of CEOs for the Financial Times recently on this very topic. The issue was, what should you take a stand on? And if you're going to take a stand, how should you do that? Because I think with all sorts of things, CEOs have been under pressure to make a stand. Some have made a stand on things where there was no pressure. But I was in California the week of the first, when it became clear that Roe versus Wade might be overturned, and with a lot of chairs and things. And people think, it's genuinely really difficult because I have bifurcated staff, I have bifurcated shareholders, I have business in many different states. They're likely to go, one way or the other. People expect me to have a personal view. And then if I have a personal view, that's going to upset a number of people, whichever way view is. It's really quite difficult for me. And one guy said to me, I'm just a businessman. I'm not a politician. But he said, but I have daughters and I have friends. And, there's a range of different views. And my job really is to try and explain what my view is in a reasonable, calm way, put up with the abuse that I might get. But if I really, if it's a moral issue and I believe that, then, I shouldn't be hiding from my morals. I should be making that clear. There's quite a difference between having a view and responding to being out there in front and trying to lead a movement. And I think that's a challenge. But the interesting issue is, I think a lot of boards now they're sitting down deciding, what are the things that we have a clear, united view on? So, for example, at the EY Foundation, we had from when we were formed a very clear view around race. We support young people on free school meals or in care. And very sadly, in our country, that's over 2 million young people, rising to 2.5 million soon. And unfortunately, ethnic minorities are way overrepresented in those groups. So, we felt it was important from the beginning to work in the most challenged kind of postcode areas across the country. We're in 17 cities. And as a consequence, we're working with a lot of different ethnic groups. And therefore, our staff, our board, the way we work has to be understanding of the issues those groups are facing. We've been hugely successful with our youth advisory board and its predecessor bodies. So the chair and the vice chair of that sit on our main board and give us a generational perspective, and they're very diverse. And they're very diverse as well. I think the rise of Horizon boards, actually, Oliver, is something I think which is going to help a lot with this, because sometimes it's not just the view that you might have; it can be the way that you articulate it or the way you think about it. So fundamentally, you might have the same view as someone else, but you just might not be in tune, understand, be as empathetic in terms of the way that you might express that. And we live in a culture that's pretty harsh on you if you at either end as a of the spectrum. And so sometimes it can just help to hear how another person hears what you say, because sometimes what you say is not what gets heard. It can be quite different. And you have to try and understand that, I think, before you open your mouth.
And just for those who aren't familiar with Horizon boards, can you just expand on that?
Yeah, so I guess they've tended to be thought of as younger boards. So it's where you might have a board which is composed of 20, 30 somethings in your organization. So Gucci is probably the best example, where Gucci it called it a shadow board, but the term most people seem to be using now is Horizons, because it's looking to the future. But Gucci wanted to look more forward, look at next generations of fashion and talent. They composed this board, and this board did a very good job at helping them to understand that they needed a digital strategy. This was before that was fashionable, and to get the right one. And I think in Matthew Zayed's Rebel Ideas book, there's a little bit of a case study about it, but they way outperformed their nearest rival, who I won't say who that was, over the next 5 years, in large part, according to that case, because of their digital strategy, which they wouldn't have got on with as quickly or as well if they hadn't had that shadow board. It's interesting. Organisations like Interbrand, EFT, there's a lot of organisations now setting these up. So the Interbrand one is, global. It's a group from across the world. They're more sort of a board that works with the senior leadership team, the exec, than the main board, because it's part of a very large group. And they provide insight, challenge. They can be powerful representatives as well. So interesting, at EY Foundation board, we have a youth advisory board member. So these are young people from 17 to 23. We have one on each of our subcommittees. So we have one on audit and risk, one on non-co, one on Remco, and I can tell you they add huge value. You have to put effort in terms of training and development, but they're brilliant. They had a different dimension to the thinking.
So one of the things that we've definitely seen is chairs suddenly having these light bulb moments when they're hiring, and they see what they perceive as a younger candidate and thinking, well, what value would they have on the board? They've got no experience. And then suddenly having that light bulb moment where 80% of their stakeholders, their employees, their suppliers, their customers are millennials, and the average age on that board table is, and often in the sort of north of 60. And they suddenly go, gosh, actually, that would bring a really interesting diversity of thought to this table. And on top of that, they normally bring some other aspect of expertise. So that's definitely something we're seeing reflected in some of the roles going through New Roles platform. I'm curious to know how else you see boards evolving. You've talked this wonderful phrase of this idea of boards moving from maps to sat-nav, this sort of idea of them being a more agile environment where they're making sort of real-time decisions based on the environmental conditions, which I love because it felt like it mirrored our own journey and the way I think about our sort of organization, where I suppose when I first started, it was very much it comes from that investor mindset of an annual report, a 5-year strategy, and now it's sort of much more flexible. We have certain pillars in place, whether it's that vision and mission, but then we've adopted a 4DX process, having evolved from an OKR system where we have a war that we are fighting for the year, and then we determine what the battles that we're looking to win in order to win that war. And then it's up to each of the teams and the squads within those teams to figure out what are the skirmishes that they will fight in order to help us win those battles. Actually, recently working with a performance coach, realized why I was never very comfortable with that language of battles and wars that come from 4DX, which is that it puts everyone in the stress mindset where actually it sets them up to underperform, reduces intelligence. So we're looking at ways of evolving that language. But I'm curious to hear what are you seeing in terms of the way boards are evolving?
Yeah, well, I suppose in the venture and private equity space, things like dynamic budgeting and lockstep approaching to spending have been sort of there for ages. We've lived in this world where it's been comforting to have a very detailed annual budget, 5-year, very detailed strategic plan. But there's a recognition actually that the world is moving more quickly. We can't predict at the beginning of the year. So it's interesting, when we set the EY Foundation up 8 years ago, we started using sort of dynamic budgeting. We started to say, well, this is what we think is the most likely outcome. But actually, if we get greater income more quickly than we thought, if we have greater impact on this program than that program, then we might, within a quarter, we might decide actually, better to invest more in that, which will have more impact, or in a corporate way, profit, and reduce the spending on that. And for that to work, you need to have the systems in place, the information, if you like, to feed that. And the reason I used the maps to sat-nav thing was that, traditionally we had our map. It was kind of fixed. The map wasn't magically updated. It wasn't a Harry Potter type map. It was the map. And you set off, you knew where you wanted to get to, and you had your route. And you kind of just sat there until the block cleared, and then you carried on, or you experimented a bit. But we have so much more live data now. If you think of even just 10 years ago, how quickly the month-end financial information was ready. Now it's not quite real time in every sector, but it's pretty damn close to for a lot. We want to make our decisions closer to junctions with better information, but we also need to plan. You can't keep shuffling in most organizations very easily the number of people that you have in every different place. That's a very challenging thing to try to do. There are some things which are step functions. If you have to make capital investment, I was on the board of the University of Warwick for 9 years. You can't sort of commit to build a building. The building is built, and then you say, oh no, we don't think it should be there. We think it should be, 500 yards to the right, or, that's not going to work. So you have to build things with flexible capabilities, so they can be, then their initial use might be obvious, but you build them in such a way that they can be, used for different purposes later if you have to, which means you spend more, but you have more flexibility. I think the disorienting thing for many board members is if you've grown up, if you've been 30 years in a paradigm which is kind of, it's easy for me to judge the management because they're meeting budget and they're meeting the strategic milestones, and now all of a sudden, you having to judge them against how are they doing relative to the context that they're in, as opposed to the absolute that they were given at the beginning of the year. That can be disorienting and hard. And I know a number of people who are not comfortable with operating in that way. I think some people also can use it as an excuse for prevarication, or an excuse for let's decide later, when it probably should be decided now. So the way I think to resolve this is by the board agreeing a kind of most likely budget, and that's the one that we're operating to, but with revision, at least once a quarter, to say we're going to spend more or less on this. The CMI had a very good example of this in COVID, where we'd already begun a big digital transformation, which was working quite well, but we thought we needed to accelerate that. So we decided, because we could, to spend more money on that. But we weren't quite sure, with COVID happening, which bits of that investment would be the ones that would have the best returns. So the way we structured that for the next sort of 9 months, year, was to say, we're going to allocate this pot of money for digital, accelerating our digital transformation. We're going to start by spending relatively small amounts in a number of areas. But then when we see the evidence that this area is actually delivering a much higher ROI than that one, we'll cut that one off, and we'll put the remaining money on that. And we give the management the flexibility to do that. So that was pre-agreed, so they knew what the parameters were that they had to operate in. They could get on and be quite agile about that. We didn't need to have another board meeting to make that decision, because, if the return on investment was this level, they could just do it. And I think that was quite a good example of being quite agile, giving management clarity, but also giving the board the assurance that they were operating within sort of guardrails, if you like, as they went.
The example of a building is an interesting one, of future-proofing it. What are some of the questions that would have been asking as a board about that in order to ensure that future-proofing? And I guess, again, there's a balance you had to strike there between, if you try and make it suitable for everything, the budget gets completely out of control, versus you don't want to suddenly discover that it works for one thing which suddenly no longer exists. So what are the questions you asked and how did you think about that?
Yeah, so in terms of, this goes to the heart of capacity planning generally, doesn't it? It's the same with an industrial factory where I started. How big should you build a factory? So you always build it bigger than the current need, a bit like airports. You don't build them for today's need because it's so expensive to rebuild it or add bits, if you like. But you can build it in a modular way. So you might build a building that's got, modular expansion possibilities. So you might do that, and you might pick a design that is modular rather than, singular, if you like. So that would be one way. Second thing, you would obviously think about, you do some sensitivity analysis around, different at Warwick, how much will the student population grow? How big will our events, conferences, businesses grow? These kind of things, you sort of build those in. How much money have you got? Sort of, that's quite a key. I'm a fan of something called linear programming. Don't worry, Oliver, this isn't as geeky as it sounds. But linear programming is essentially, it's a mathematical tool which enables you to make a decision, typically used for resource allocation. And the joy of it is it allows you to have multiple objectives. It allows you and forces you actually to put in what resources you have, what constraints you have. But what that does then is it sort of iterates around a number of different solutions which satisfy the most important objectives. Often in life, we think about, we just, we're humans, we tend to think, oh, well, it's, this is the most important thing, when actually life generally is a little bit more complicated than that. And it also enables you then to assess risk. So, if you only buy 1,000 trucks, you run the risk, because these trucks might be quite specialized. You can't suddenly have another 100 trucks. So you might have 1,050 to hedge for the upside. Because often what happens on boards is there will tend to be more focus on the downside than the upside. And I think if you looked at Zoom through the company Zoom through the COVID crisis, I think it looked like they played that balancing act pretty well, the board there, between the scale up but not going too far. They could have scaled even more, but they were worried about, how long will this last, and how sticky will it be?
Why do you think that is, that boards tend to focus more on the downside? Is that loss aversion, or do you think there's something else that drives that? Is it just easier to do, to be the critic rather than the visionary?
No, I think the pressures from regulators, markets, the press, cocking up in the UK is not a nice thing to do. So, if you think about it, inevitably, if you've had a very successful career, why would you want to blow it for just a little bit more profit or success? There probably is a natural, and these things are sort of, they may be fine margins rather than, big swings. But I think inevitably, and if you think, you have to, a big part of your role is to ensure the organisation's sustainability. Clearly, that's a bigger need. That's the first need, and then it's to do as well as you can, rather than to do as well as you can, and you may or may not be able to ensure it's sustainable.
That point around the sort of the you said in the UK, it's not a good thing to muck up. Do you think there are other geographies in your experience where there's more of a black box thinking mindset, where people recognize that mistakes are okay and are good learning opportunities, or do you think that's a universal challenge?
I think in the US, in Nigeria, in a number of other countries, there's a more liberal attitude towards risk. I think, though, that's probably quite different to black box thinking, because black box thinking, in my mind, is a really intense examination of why it didn't work, and then a really strong communication of the lessons from that throughout the organisation, like in an aircraft accident. And I think Matthew Syed's written a very good book called Black Box Thinking, which is, how come in many other walks of life we don't apply that thinking? It requires transparency. It requires people putting their hands up and saying, we crashed. it requires people putting the resources in to understand the crash. I think in the US, culturally, what tends to happen more is that went wrong. Let's do something different. I don't get a sense culturally. I mean, many organizations do, but there's that kind of attention on let's learn the lessons from that. I certainly don't think that's a very common thing in the UK for people to do, is it?
No. Always been very inspired by that Matthew Syed book, and always try to make us as an organization more like the aerospace industry and less like the healthcare industry, where that failure is punished and as a result innovation is killed.
And it's remarkable how in the aviation industry, you look at those accident rates still today, they're phenomenal, really. When you think of weather, the number of components, all of these things, it's a phenomenal success. And actually, black box thinking has driven a lot of that. But it costs to do that.
Do you think there's more boards in the UK and globally can do to put themselves on the right end of that spectrum?
Yeah, I think there is. I think it's interesting. A number of boards now are starting to do more around decision review and also, thinking about how we made that decision. So, for example, I try to have 15 minutes at the end of each board I chair where we just reflect on how we did today. And that will include, do you think we rushed that decision? Do you think we took too long over that? How do you think we left the management feeling? So we might have all got our points across, but they might be feeling not as uplifted by the experience as the non-execs, or equally, were we as challenging as we should be? So I think the review I don't think we have enough time to reflect generally. It's something I really try to carve time out for, is to reflect. And I think a lot about, partly because I think no matter how long you've been a chair, you've never quite nailed it, in my view. And I come out of every board meeting thinking, how can I do that bit better? And I spend a lot of time chatting with other chairs, and we talk to each other about, different sort of board moments or different challenges to try and help each other get a bit like a sort of a bad AA group in a way, we kind of.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge. There's a chair I know who basically has one of, I think it's the lead independent director, at the end of every meeting, send them a what went well, even better if email. And they sort of requested that as a standing item, which I always thought was a brilliant idea, because it's an interesting challenge sometimes as a board member. How do you give feedback to the chair? If they don't invite it and welcome it, it can actually be quite an intimidating thing to have to do, to sort of go along to the chair and say, look, I don't think you did that very well. And you sort of run the risk of it.
Yeah, you do need to invite it, though. I mean, one thing I'd like to do with new board members is, in between them getting the papers and the first board meeting, I'll generally have a chat, because is there any things they particularly points they want to make in a meeting, so I can introduce them to that point if there's no natural point for them. And usually I will try and fix up a chat with them a couple of days after the board meeting. And the way that I set this up is always, because I'd love to hear your views on how you think the board did. So immediately they've got that opportunity, and immediately, and that's always a two-way conversation as well, because they're keen to know how they did too. I've never been a fan of saving it all up for one conversation at the end of the year. I'm a much prefer drippy, nudgy feedback through the year, rather than kind of waiting and having some sort of sterile conversation. I think, if you've got things to say, you have to pick your time carefully, where people are receptive and where there's, the atmosphere, the place, all of that is good. Not in front of others and all the rest of it. But I think, give it as you go is probably, and take it as you go. And so I'm always keen for people to tell me what I've not done as well as I could.
You're clearly in the bracket of high-performing chairs who welcome that, who need more of.
Not yet. well, I welcome it, but I don't know whether I'm high-performing or not. It's for others to judge.
Patrick, you talked a lot earlier around the importance of people, and you talked there again about the importance of getting those people right once you've got the people. But how do you go about, when you're assessing prospective new board members, What are you looking for? We have, one of the powerful things about the Nurole platform is I think it's increased the level of competition of people going for these roles. So organizations are spoiled for choice. You don't get the part-time director anymore coming through who's just there for a nice lunch. They are brutally competitive, these roles. So what are you looking for as a board member? And I guess part of that question is also as for someone who's looking to get a board role, how can they stand out? What are the things that an individual could do to make themselves stand out? You've talked a little bit earlier around sort of self-awareness. That obviously is something you can potentially show at an interview. You've talked in the past about the importance of potentially sort of, verbal and numerical reasoning, people's ability to digest board papers. That's something people could do tests to show. You actually introduced me to the concept, the Kilman modes of conflict, this idea that people under stress have different ways of handling conflict, whether it's competing, collaborating, accommodating, avoiding, compromising. Again, all things that you can probably assess as a chair. But what are you looking for when people are putting themselves forward?
Yeah, I suppose there's three things I really zone in on. So the first is judgment. Do I get a sense that this person's got a good sense of judgment of people, of situations? And often people, when they're looking for a non-exec or a trustee, they go for sectoral kind of functional kind of things. And actually someone's situational experience, talking about that, hearing them talk about that, will tell you more about their judgment, the way they approach things, the way they challenge, all of that. So I think judgment is a bedrock of a good director. But of course, we all know people who are irritatingly right, frighteningly clever, but frightening, just not very collaborative in their approach. So I think you need very good interpersonal skills to be a really good director, because then you can start to bring those judgments to bear. You can influence people. You can manage the conflicts. You know when it's the right moment to stand up and be counted, and that, for me, that's particularly around values-based things. When, going to war on this point is just, it's not really worth it. It's not really as profound as your volume of your voice or the angle of your body would suggest. So interpersonal skills, I think, are really good. And the ability to engender respect is a big part of that, because I think it's very hard to influence someone who doesn't respect you. And you can't take that for granted. You have to build that, and you have to keep building that. And the final thing, so of the three, so judgment, interpersonal skill, I would say is antennae. So, and I think this might be, the data savviness or that sensing ability. You're picking something out from the information that you're getting, whether it's, through your ears, through your eyes, you're sensing stuff. And I think the people who are curious tend to have more finely tuned antennae than those who are quite tunneled in their view. So I'm really interested when I'm talking to people about their different life experiences, their different things they might be doing, whether they've got the ability to see the organization in its context as opposed to just see the organization. It's really interesting when if someone comes to an interview and they can tell you stuff about the website that no chair would know. It's buried 5 levels down, and they've prided themselves on how they've researched every page of the website, but they've no idea who the competitors are or who the suppliers are or what the regulator's saying. And so I quite like people who see, like in a solar system way, they see the Earth, the organization, in the context of the planets around it and the things which influence it. I really like that. It's part of the judgment bit. I think the thing I didn't say was I think people who are grounded and they're going to focus on the right things. So they're open-minded, they're actively open-minded, but they know what are the key drivers for this organization, the things which will really make it successful and keep it successful, as opposed to stuff that's peripheral. You can waste a lot of time in board meetings on peripheral stuff if you don't have people who are, really understanding of the financial dynamics of the organization, or the market dynamics of the organization, or the people dynamics of the organization.
Got it. And I suppose I think all of those things you just talked about there are not normally things that jump out of a CV. You need to meet the people in person. So how are you thinking about who you choose to meet in person? Because I imagine you would only ever meet, I don't know what, 3 to maybe 6, 7 people at an interview stage for a role. How are you choosing that group, and what is it that's standing out to you typically in order to come up with that list? And I ask this because I sometimes get some very capable people coming to me and saying, well, look, I could do this role. And my response is often, look, there's no question you could do the role. There are more people that could do these roles than there are roles available. The question is, how do you stand out? How do you look exceptional? How do you make yourself one of those people that, the chair that Patrick, when he sees them coming through, says, I've got to meet that person? What is it for you? What are the hallmarks for you of those that you're pulling through?
It's usually character related, because especially you are very good at, if you set the criteria, you're going to get candidates that meet the criteria. And a number of others are very good at saying, well, there's this other person who doesn't quite fit all of it, just feels like they might actually be right for the situation. So given there are a number of people who meet the criteria, it's then down to those character things. Will they, and it's interesting with ESSA, Education Sub-Saharan Africa, we have a majority African board, and our last 3 board members we chose through COVID. We didn't have the opportunity to physically meet them. We had to do it all by Zoom. They're all women, they're all CEOs, they're from different countries. They have a different range of personalities, but every one of them has a bit of edge. They have a little they're very charming, they're quite steely, but they've got a little bit of edge. They're sort of, I don't know, there's no other way to describe it. And it was interesting when we were interviewing, we interviewed some absolutely fantastic people. These 3 stood out because they challenged in a slightly different way to the others. They had read stuff and they saw something in that information that we hadn't quite seen. And they were bold enough and confident enough and charming enough to put that in a way that made you stop and go, that's really interesting. So when I'm interviewing for non-execs or trustees, I think it's the people who make you think. That's really, really important. And my grandmother gave me this great piece of advice. She was Irish, didn't really have any education. We were sort of Irish immigrants into Liverpool. And she said, it's really important to listen to what people say, but it's even more important to listen to what they think. And sometimes when I'm sitting in someone, I'm thinking, well, they're saying the right things, but I'm not really sure they're thinking those things. I think they're giving what they think is the right answer. And I think one vital ingredient for a non-exec is there's occasions where you have to be diplomatic and so on. But actually, when you're with your colleagues and it really, really matters, I need to know what you think. And if they're not prepared to do that, to demonstrate that in an interview, then they're probably not going to do that in a board meetings, are they?
Yeah, very interesting. That brings me on to this question around sort of diversity. You sort of touched on there, I think, when you said that when you talk about that edge that people bring, that they make you think differently. I suppose a part of that is sort of cognitive diversity, but you also touched on some of the demographic diversity of that group as well. It feels to me that we're at an interesting point in time at the moment where a significant portion of the world is vocally advocating for diversity and the power of diversity. And yet there's another part of the world, possibly at this stage less visibly or less vocally, is resisting some of that sort of call to diversity. And the lawsuit in California of removing quotas, I suppose, would be a recent example of that. Where do you think organizations go from here on this diversity question and challenge?
So I think the place to start is, what's the point? And the point is, so you get a better decision, you get better outcomes. One level of point. The second level of point is you have more legitimacy and credibility in the space that you operate. And the third thing is really around, which is a collective responsibility, I think, especially for major corporates and major organizations, that if we don't make things more equitable, who will? And so I think those are the three ways in which I think of it. I think the first one around insight, so will we get better decisions? I think that's having relevant diversity, and also so you cover more of the problem space type diversity. That started I remember some really trite stuff being talked about when we were doing a Higgs review about, support to have a woman on the board because half our customers are women. And they would sort of just, that would be enough. I think it's a lot more to it than that. So at the moment, I feel very frustrated that disability in all its forms, those that you can see and those that you can't, is massively underrepresented in the boards. We don't even know what the score is. We've made reasonable progress on gender. The momentum is there. We've made marginal progress around ethnicity, loads more to do, but we've done nothing really on disability. It's interesting. I do a number of LinkedIn articles, and the LinkedIn article that had the least views, least coverage, was one about disability, the blind spot. People just aren't really that interested, so I think this third point around we have a sort of collective responsibility. I think that I sort of feel that, and if you're a small organization, clearly you can't change the whole thing, but you can do your little bit in a way. I also don't think it's healthy to have boards that are too big. And actually, mathematically, it would become quite challenging to have every group that you thought should be represented on boards in general, on your board. I just think that you just end up with very big boards. And I think one of the reasons Horizon boards are really good is that gives you a mechanism to increase your diversity and actually have a kind of pathway, if you like, as well, through to the main board too, to widen diversity. You can achieve diversity in lots of different ways. I think most people understand when any board is doing it for form rather than substance. I think it's pretty obvious, and I think we need a lot more. We need more substance.
God, Patrick, what a brilliant response! Thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, the time has come for the 5-question quickfire. So where I say a statement and we'll ask you for a quick response and reason why, if that works. So first up is the best book every board member should read and why. And I'm not going to allow you to do Boards: A Practical Perspective, which is your book, although it should be on every board member's read list. But I'd like to hear another one from you.
It's a close run thing between Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom and Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. But I would pick Nelson Mandela's book because the inspiration, tenacity, resilience, judgment, leadership, all of those things is just so inspiring. I think that is just a brilliant book.
Fantastic. Your favorite quote and why?
I think it's probably my grand's. And it's really important to listen to what people say, but even more important to listen to what they think. I think it's gold in the boardroom, if you can read the room.
Fantastic. Your best ever holiday?
Oh, that's a tough one. Probably Alaska, because I did a holiday just after I retired, took my boys and their partners, the family. We had 3 weeks, no mobile phones. It was just brilliant. And it was breathtakingly beautiful, but also very sad in a way as well to see what we've done to the climate. And, I made good the damage we did by going there, but it was a very formative trip for me.
Amazing. Your most significant professional insight? Nice, easy one.
I think it's either that purpose, people, process triangle, which I used. People at 3i would probably be bored of it, but I use that in managing teams. I've used it in changing boards. Probably been the most useful thing for me through my professional life. The other one, which would run a close second, is a bell curve with effectiveness on the vertical and pressure on the horizontal. And trying to manage yourself and your teams, your organizations, to get the balance of pressure right so you're as highly effective, not a headless chicken and not asleep.
Brilliant. And last but not least, your favorite app?
That's really tough. Probably the BBC Radio, which I love.
And why?
I love the idea that there's an editor who's way, way better than me. I listen to programs about things I never thought I was interested in and then became interested in. I love the variety of different radio channels, whether that be music or current affairs or science or history, or I just think it's a fantastic companion to have. And wherever I'm traveling around the world, especially in Africa, I love that.
Brilliant. Well, Patrick, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Your wisdom oozes through, and anyone who wants to hear more should go read your book because it is also brilliant. I highly recommend it. But thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thanks, Oliver.